besties. So I was born a Christian, and then I was an atheist, and then I was a witch, and now I have reverted to Islam. And this is part 2 of the story of how all of that unfolded. Now, once again, I want to make the disclaimer that if you are not grown, you need to run this story by your parents before you watch all of it, okay? It just is not a family-friendly story, so please. Now, where I had left off, I had just found out that I was expecting a child after I was assaulted by a man. I really want you guys to understand how that feels. I had just survived a vicious attack on my body, and I almost didn't survive. I hadn't been diagnosed with PTSD yet, but I certainly had it. I was jobless, and there was a monster illness that nobody knew anything about that was completely shutting the world down. Up until that point, I had never felt fear like that in my life. And keep in mind, I still considered myself an atheist at this point. So my doctor had called. She had told me I had hit the floor. I was having a complete breakdown. But I remember talking to my doctor and, no, I'm fine. I'll talk to you later. And I hung up the phone. And I immediately called my best friend, who is like a sister to me. And she knew what had happened to me. And I just said the words, I'm pregnant. And she knew I had no job, and she immediately said, I will pay for it. You don't have to go through this. I'm going to pay for it. We will make an appointment right now. And I was and am very pro-choice. And at that point in time, I was seriously considering being child-free for my life. And yet, somehow when she said those words, something incredible happened. It was like a hand on my chest. Not in an unpleasant way, but firm and unmoving, just pressure. And then it was just like weight spread through my entire body, like I had turned to stone. But not in an unpleasant way, like as if somebody wrapped you in a weighted blanket. And I heard quite distinctly a very soft, very firm voice in my head. And the voice said, you will have this baby will live, and you will love him. And with that, an absolute certainty just spread through my body. Like a light. Like if the first feeling was like stone, the second feeling was like a light. And I told my friend, no, I'm keeping it. And you need to know the level of shock that everybody had over me making that decision. Because I was not the girl who would make that decision. But from that very first day, that very first moment, I was absolutely certain. And I have never once wavered in that certainty. And at this point, I want to jump in and say that I struggled with sharing this story publicly because this is not just my story, this is my son's story. And I want to say to anybody who hears or spreads this story, my son cannot help where he came from. My own father is a terrible person. So many people have fathers who are terrible people. I won't even insult the person who did this publicly because my son has a genetic link to that person. And whatever terrible decisions he made, many of us are capable of terrible decisions in the right circumstances. So what I'm saying is be respectful of my child. We can move on with the story now. I managed to get a job. I managed to get housing. And for a while, it seemed like things were going to get better. I got into therapy, but I was alone. I was pregnant. I'm crying again. It's hard going through that by yourself. I mean, my family supported me, but when I went home to an empty house. So anyway, I was terrified to have this baby in a hospital. Not just because of this insane virus that was going around, but because I was so scared that I would end up with a male doctor or a male nurse or a male anything when I went into labor. Because you see, for months, I could not be touched by men. I couldn't be alone in a room with a man. I mean, even my stepfather, I'm shaking thinking about it because I'm putting myself back into the story. Even my own stepfather giving me a hug, I would cringe. So I tried to go through a local birth center. All female midwives, a homey, natural environment. Because you see, I was also terrified to be medicated against my will because of what had happened when I was assaulted. I was so scared of anything being done against my will. And I thought, if I can have this baby naturally and surrounded by women, none of that'll happen and it'll be fine. Wow. I was 2 weeks past my due date. I went into labor on a Friday night at 7:30. My mom came over and stayed the night with me. My labor progressed very slowly, and you aren't supposed to go into the birth center until your contractions are like 2 to 3 minutes apart. It finally got there the next day. I don't even remember what time, but it was in the afternoon. And so we went to the birth center, and the nurse that was on call was not my favorite nurse who was there. And she immediately decided that I was being dramatic. In the politest terms possible, she checked me, and it was terrible and deeply, 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 deeply upset me. I mean, I went into hysterics, and the birth center knew my history, so that was to be expected. And I remember even like, calming down and wiping my tears and apologizing to her and just saying, I'm sorry, it's a physical reaction, I can't control it. But from that moment on, she just treated me like I was a dramatic nuisance. Things progressed. I'd been in labor for over 24 hours, and I started to feel like something was wrong. I was having pain that I had not been told to expect. I was having back labor really badly, which I know does happen, but I was also starting to get a very sharp pain in my hip. And even my mom mentioned to the midwife, when she contracts, it looks like the baby is diagonal. Are you sure that he's head down? She said, yes, he's head down. I told her, I feel like something's wrong. My heart is racing. There's a sharp pain. She was on her phone. She was on her phone the whole time. And she barely glances up from her phone and looks at me and says, yeah, well, labor hurts. It got to a point where I completely could not cope. I was screaming. I was fainting. They had a bed, and I was laying on it with my mother, just clinging to her. And I would pass out, and I would come to scream, and then I would pass out again. And the contractions did not have a break between them. It was like one long, like they would peak and come down a little bit and then immediately peak again. And the torment of that. I have never felt pain like that. So my mom and my aunt were getting extremely frustrated with the nurse and her lack of action, and went, isn't there something you can give her? She said she could give me pain medicine. Didn't tell us what it was. You know what they said George Floyd was on? It starts with an F. She injected me with that without telling me what it was. Now, that is permissible as a pain relief in labor, but only when the baby is very close to being born, because it is extremely dangerous for both the mother and the baby. And at that point, I completely lost my ability to cope whatsoever, because once again, I was paralyzed. It did nothing for the pain. My mom says that I just went limp, but I was still screaming. So, alhamdulillah, she and my aunt made the decision to take me to the hospital. I had been promised that this birth center would call an ambulance in the event of an emergency. The nurse did not. My mother and my aunt had to half carry, half drag me to my mother's truck, and my mother drove me to the hospital. The nurse called ahead and told the hospital that I had only been in labor for 12 hours. When I arrived there, I had been in labor for 30. They checked me. They found that I had not progressed at all, which after 30 hours of labor is an extremely concerning thing. But I digress. Once again, I almost lost my life, and my child almost lost his. They had 2 IVs going into me at the same time because I was so dehydrated, and I remember a doctor screaming at the nurses that it wasn't enough and that they needed to hang more fluid. I watched my blood pressure drop to 26/47. I am not a healthcare professional, but I'm told that's bad. I heard my son's heart rate on the monitor going boop, boop, boop. And they rushed me into an emergency C-section, which is a trauma in and of itself. They tear your clothes from you. They throw you onto a table, bright lights, people everywhere. You can't move, and you're awake, and you can feel all this pulling and tugging. And my son was so severely stuck in my hip that my body was doing this from them trying to get him out. When he came out, he wouldn't breathe. They held him up for me, and he was so dark purple, he was almost black. I didn't hear him cry, and they immediately took him from me. And at that point, I went under. I don't know if I fainted or if they put me in, or if I was about to lose my life. I don't know. But I saw, it was just a kaleidoscope of color. It was like flying into the sun. And I screamed out for that voice that I had heard when I first found out I was pregnant. I screamed at the voice and I said, "You told me my baby would live." And in that moment, I was just enveloped in this energy of light and love and peace. And I just felt in my bones, it's going to be okay. Your baby will live. And then I woke up in a recovery room, and now we're going to go into a part 3.